Good evening and welcome to Plexal Cyberlates. Tonight we're going to be talking all about space, new space sector, emerging technologies, and I'm joined by Lydia Kerin, my colleague, who's leading a lot of our research on new space technologies at the moment. And then we'll move over to an interview with Dr Ramy Shelbaya from Quantum Dice, who's the CEO and co-founder, to tell us a little bit about what it's like to be a startup working in this space. All right, so Lydia, thank you for joining us at Cyberlates.
No worries. Is this working okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, okay. So I think one of the things that a Plexal member actually asked me today was, what do we mean when we talk about new space? Because, you know, we had a man walking on the moon in 1969. For any Star Trek fans in the house, we've been talking about space being the final frontier for a while. So when I say new space to you, what do you think about?
So new space is basically SMEs not taking over, but being a lot more prominent within the space sector. So it's usually really dominated by state actors such as NASA, or government. So new space is, the boundaries have been lowered for entry, lower cost, and just generally more accessible. So there is a lot of value being recognised in SMEs for their innovation, and governments and those state actors are now a lot more open to collaborate with SMEs. So that is new space technology.
And I hear a lot about lower cost of entry as well. Do you think that's a factor in why we're seeing this change in the market?
Yeah, absolutely. But as well as a lower cost, I think a lot of industrialization in space is being kind of prompted by strategic aims. So the UK, for example, we've got a big strategic aim of net zero, and there are some companies who are taking, carbon out of Earth and into space. There's one called Spaceforge, which is a really cool company. Yeah. They're leveraging the benefits of space, its weightlessness, its consistent temperature, and its lack of gravity, and they're manufacturing in space. It's really interesting. So
Spaceforge, I have to check that one out. And then that brings me on to my next question, which we've preempted slightly, in terms of the sorts of technologies that are now being deployed as part of the new space landscape. So beyond space manufacturing, are there other areas that we're seeing a lot of growth?
Yeah, so there is, as you say, just general spacecraft design, a lot of nano satellites, cube satellites, which are basically just super small satellites, which is a reason why SMEs are now able to put them up in space, and they are being used for things such as, again, fighting climate change. So they're able to monitor carbon, they're able to monitor heat across the world, and so that is one side of it, just spacecraft design. But there's also, as I mentioned before, services and support infrastructure, microgravity as a surface. So it is really, really broad.
Yeah, I've seen some nanosats where you could arguably build one at your kitchen table, which feels quite exciting. I mean, not me, but someone technically capable could do it. So I think the thing when it comes to cyber, increased tech stack, increased complexity in the infrastructure, more vulnerabilities, more risks. So one of the things we were talking about was, are we anticipating a rise in cyber attacks on space technologies? Is that a hypothetical far-off scenario, or is that something that we're already seeing?
No, so it's not hypothetical at all. Only in February there was a attack against a group of satellites, and the NCSC, so that's the National Cybersecurity Centre, which is part of GCHQ, one of the UK's intelligence services. They, along with the EU and the US, have all attributed that to Russia, and that was, just before the Russian attack on the Ukrainian war, so it's not hypothetical at all. And I think we all know the increased number of cyber attacks. Inevitably, that's going to be cyber attacks in space as well. It has huge cascade effects. So with the attack I've just mentioned, that was initially planned to take out Ukrainian kind of military satellites, but that had huge effects all over Europe. People lost signal, even just TVs, that kind of thing. So it affects everyone.
Okay, so be scared. And then finally, just preempting our meeting with Quantum Dice as well, where do you think there's a role to play for SMEs and startups in addressing some of these risks specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes.
I mean, if you'd said no, that'd be very awkward. Yeah.
SMEs, I mean, at Plexal, we love an SME, we love a startup, but that is where we're going to find so much of the innovation that can help target these really, perhaps some quite niche problems, but absolutely.
Yeah, okay, excellent. All right, well, thank you very much for your time,
worries,
Lydia.
thank you.
And then we'll hand over to Ramy. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Hello, thank you for joining us at Cyberlates.
Thank you for having me.
Cyberlates. It'd be great if I've heard a lot about quantum dice personally, and I feel like every time I talk to someone in your team, the email signature has changed with another award you've won. But for anyone in the room that's not heard of you, it'd be great to just hear a bit more about what quantum dice is.
Yes, of course. So we are an Oxford University spin-out. So what we're doing is we're taking technology that was developed in the Department of Physics, and we're bringing it to market. So this technology is basically a novel random number generator, which I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about later, that basically uses quantum mechanical processes to generate secure entropy that can be used then in a wide range of applications. So although you might really have never heard of a random number generator before, you probably use one most likely at least every hour. So almost every cybersecurity system we have, and I'm talking about everything from the things that are used in military applications to the thing that secure your WhatsApp messages. All of these systems rely at their core on randomness. There has to be some kind of random key that's generated that's then used as a method of encrypting your messages, encrypting your data, encrypting critical national infrastructure facilities, encrypting many different things. And so the quality of that randomness is essential to the security of the system. So no matter how good your algorithm is, if your core isn't good, then everything else falls apart. And there have been many, many cases before of breaches and cyber attacks that have happened specifically due to faulty random number generation. So one of the examples is a couple of years ago, there was a scientist who wanted to look at RSA keys. So RSA is one of the most common methods of encryption that we use. And they just got some of the keys that are found online, and they found that at least 3% of them have poor randomness. And that's 3% of a huge number. So it is a big problem. It's going to get worse and worse as we rely more and more on connected systems. So as we bring connectivity not just to our laptops, to our smartphones, we are now bringing it to our vacuum cleaners, to our fans, and everything now connects to the internet. So what we are developing is basically using one of the most purely random processes known to man, which is a quantum mechanical process, and using that to generate secure randomness. So what we're focusing on right now is to take this, what was originally just a table-sized device, and to bring it down to a scale that can be integrated not just in servers, where it's also needed, but as well as in smartphones and in small connected systems, where it's also needed. So this is a long-term process, but we are taking it step by step.
Yeah, sobering stuff. I think every time I come to a Cyberlates, I get slightly more concerned about the state of the world, which is great. But you're fixing it. So I feel like there's an almost infinite amount of use cases for your product then. So it'd be great to know why space, like what role are you hoping that quantum dice will play in the new space market?
Of course. So I'll talk maybe a bit about the CubeSats that you were mentioning. So one of the things that people are now working hard on is to try to get more secure communication through space systems. So, I mean, you have companies like, for example, SpaceX, who are launching satellite constellations, where the idea is to create easier connectivity, easier network connectivity. So as soon as you talk about network connectivity, you have to talk about cybersecurity, because that means that there is data that's being constantly transmitted. And now, once you make your system smaller, so if you go from a traditional large satellite to a small satellite, that means that the complexity of the tools that you can put on that system reduces, because the system is now smaller, it doesn't have as much capacity. So the criticality of securing it increases, because that means that you now have these systems which are very difficult to secure properly just because of all the constraints you have in them. And that's talking specifically about CubeSats and specifically about certain ways people have been trying to use CubeSats for secure communications. There are a number of companies, both in the UK and worldwide, that are developing what are called quantum key distribution systems. So this is a particular protocol for communication that uses certain quantum mechanical effects to secure systems. They also need secure keys, so they also need random number generation, but they're developing a different encryption protocol, basically. So there's a company, for example, in the UK called Craft Prospect, which is developing these systems using CubeSats, and we are working with them to give them those initial secure keys that they need for the communication protocol. Now, this is talking specifically about like really one use case. You have many, many different ones. So it's not just about communication. If you launch satellite constellations that are designed for monitoring or designed for getting data, right? Something in space, that means that it can have access to quite sensitive information that you don't necessarily want others to be able to easily access. So the more we deploy these systems, the more it becomes critical to be sure that we don't have bad actors having access to them. And of course, the space is interesting because it presents a very strong challenge to how can a system be deployed there and be able to work effectively over the period that this system is going to be up there. It's not like you can send tech support easily to fix it. So the advantage that our system can bring is because we have a built-in what we call self-certification, this method that allows us to continuously evaluate the quality of the output. That makes us quite robust against environmental disturbance. And in space, you have plenty of environmental disturbance. In fact, that's one of the main things that a lot of our partners have talked to us about, which is our ability to withstand these kind of environmental threats that are commonplace when you send something in such a harsh environment as space.
So you mentioned your partners in Craft Prospect, and I think we've got quite a few SMEs and startups in the room. It'd be really interesting to know a bit more about your journey into this market, because I think you hear a lot about all the potential of new space for SMEs, but it'd be great to know, how have you found that? Going direct? Do you have to go with partners?
So it depends really on what you're deploying, right? Yeah. So there are certain companies that go straight and launch. Mm-hmm. So they basically have their own system, they get a CubeSat, and then they work with one provider that helps them launch it into orbit. Yeah. What we are doing is more of providing one part of a larger solution. Mm-hmm. So we have to work with a partner because at the end of the day, they're the ones who have to compile all the different components and then send it to space. Our primary development isn't space. It's just one of the end uses. Yeah. So for that reason, specifically for us, it has been essential to work with a partner. And in general, even when you are developing a full solution, it's going to be very rare that you can do everything end to end. You're going to have to partner up with someone at some level. It could be at the level of just a launch partner, but it's very rare to see an SME just take the process from end to end, where they design the whole thing, build it, and then launch it themselves. It's not that commonplace.
And how have you found the culture in that ecosystem as well? I mean, without naming names, there's some massive giants in the space, and have they been receptive to working with SMEs?
So I think that that sector is quite receptive to innovation in general. Okay. They don't have any particular qualms about working with SMEs, but I think a word of warning, I would say. I mean that's framing it a bit too negatively. But something to note is that space takes time. So there are set launch dates that are very hard to move around. Generally, there is a pretty long period of development that you need to do. And a big part of that is because you have a process that takes a long time from design to actual execution, and that has a very low fault tolerance. So you have to be really sure of what you're doing once you actually do it. So there are many, many different steps to something. So a partnership can start in 1 month, like say you started now in June 2022. By the time you actually get to your first actual activity, it could be June 2023. Even longer. It all depends on what are you deploying. So that's why you need to be careful and plan way ahead when you're approaching a market like that. So they are receptive, but at the same time, it takes time.
So even with the lower cost of launch, I think fail fast is probably not a particularly welcome motto in space. No, it needs to be right first time.
Yeah, I mean, in general, these things are still, when they say lower, it's relatively
still
lower.
Pretty expensive
exactly.
to launch a satellite.
It's still pretty expensive. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. I was speaking to one of your co-founders, George, the other day, and he was particularly excited that you've space tested one of your capabilities now. I think a lot of people talk about that. Why do you think that space testing is so important?
Yes.
And for some of the audience, what do we mean by space testing?
So I think that, so space testing here is the idea that when you are sending a component into space, so as I mentioned before, if something goes wrong with it, that's it, it's done. you have to think about your next launch. So you need to be sure that it's gonna, number one, survive the journey. It's a pretty harsh trip. The same way we do astronaut training to make sure that astronauts can survive G-forces, can survive the kind of harsh environments that you go through as you leave our little blue dot. The same thing you have to do with space components, with electronic components. When they're going on that journey up there, it's gonna involve a lot of vibrations. It's gonna involve some pretty drastic temperature fluctuations. We don't really think about it here on Earth because we have a nice atmosphere, at least for now. But when you go up there, there could be huge temperature fluctuations that you experience inside of your system. There is, of course, no protective layer to protect you against radiation. So all of these things can be very harmful to electronic components. I mean, think about it this way, like you worry about your phone if you leave it in a hot car too long. Yeah. The same kind of electronic components you bring to space, you have to be sure that they're gonna survive the trip. So when we were planning for integrating our components, one of the things we did was book tests that you do just in facilities on Earth. It's actually quite funny. All they do is they take your system, they put it in like a very expensive oven, and they just like to crank up the heat and see how it works. The other thing is just put it on like a nice plate and it just vibrates, and they see if it survives. And I mean, you might think that it should be fine, right? These are things that are really well engineered, but the problem is when you engineer these things, you're not really thinking of, oh, what happens if something just shakes it unbelievably strongly. So this kind of space qualification is really important, but at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding. Even with all of this, you could send it and it doesn't work. Yeah. So space testing is important, but the other thing that gives you a lot of credibility is flight heritage. Is the idea that I have sent this component, it went up and it worked. Yeah. That is a huge advantage. We're still not there yet, but hopefully, hopefully we will.
Okay, I feel like we should get a very expensive oven at Plexal and get into this. That sounds quite fun. I'm really conscious that we said there'd be time for audience questions as well, so quite a lot of ground covered. Do we have a roving mic? Hello, yeah, okay. Anyone with any questions for Ramy? Okay, there we go. I'm being very polite here, look at this. You can both ask a question, it's all right.
Hello there, thanks very much. My question's around partnerships. I see quite a lot working for the Ministry of Defence that one of the real key benefits is linking up with a partner that already has access, whether it's an Airbus or BAE Systems that's already launching into space or sending the buses into space. How important do you see that as engaging with one of those big players?
So I think it's going to be important when it comes to scaling. So I think working with a small player, you get to like focus a lot on this particular project and this particular launch. Working with a big player, they always have their eye on the big picture. They want to see, okay, so even if you can do it once, can you do it reliably? Can you do it 10 times? Can you do it 5 times, hundreds of times? And that is something that is a next step for us, but it's going to be an exciting one because the challenges are very, very different. It no longer becomes, can this work? It becomes, is this reproducible? Which is a different question, but an equally exciting one.
Yeah, thanks very much.
This is very convenient. Hi, my name's Jason, and I'm Ruby and Lydia's colleague here at Plexal. It's just kind of Space 101 for the uninitiated. Isn't there a lot of space junk and a lot of satellites, and is there capacity issues just around stuff bumping into each other, especially with more and more companies sending stuff into space?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair question. Do you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's one of the reasons you need to get space tested, right? You don't want to be contributing more to that junk. So the idea is, yes, it is a finite space, no pun intended. But I think what we're trying to be is we're always conscious about not adding too much where this doesn't need to be the case. But I think that's something that all the companies are actively thinking about. And that's why you see a lot of, that's one of the reasons that actually makes it slow. That's what you want to make sure that you get it right, and you get it right once, so you don't have to keep repeating it all over again. I think this is going to have to be a conversation that is not just with SMEs. I think at some point this has to be a, not even a national, but an international conversation about how we treat our orbits around the Earth and how we make sure that we're not abusing it too much. Now, humans don't have a great track record of these conversations, but hopefully we're getting better at it. And I think this is something that we're going to see evolve over the next couple of years.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think certainly some of the companies that I've spoken to in this space, it just comes back to risk reward. Some of what they're trying to do is, you know, early warning systems for extreme climate events, or extending connectivity access into areas of the world that still don't have it. So all noble causes, but yeah, I agree. It's getting a bit crowded up there, and there's some really cool startups actually working on solutions to that too. So maybe that's part 2 of this. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hi, thanks. So I wanted to ask, how do you quantify how random a random number generator is, and how much more random is your quantum option compared to the best competing classical alternatives?
Okay. Well, I hope you guys don't have any dinner plans. So, okay. So just a quick answer to that question. So, how do we quantify how random something is a really complex problem. But just to give you the gist of it, think about the difference between throwing a coin and rolling a dice. Which do you think is more random? Right, the dice is, right? Because it's more difficult to guess what a dice is going to land on. It's a 50-50 chance with a coin, but it's only 1 in 6 chance for a dice. So the difficulty to predict something, the difficulty to guess, is one of many different metrics of randomness. But it is one that's probably most crucial and most used in cybersecurity. So difficulty of guessing. Think of that as your metric. Now, how much more difficult it is to guess our system relative to the others is an entire research paper, basically. So there is a whole theoretical framework that tells you how difficult it is to guess a particular process. And so our system is based on a theoretical model that shows that for our particular process, we can not only get something that's difficult to guess, i.e. has good randomness, but we know how much difficult it is to guess it. And that's what's crucial. What's important isn't having more of randomness, right? Because if you need more, just repeat the process. What's important is to know how much you have of that. And that's the advantage that we have over other systems. This is what we call the self-certification. It tells you how difficult it is to guess that particular output. And that's what you need in your encryption system. Because otherwise, you could think that you have a lot, but then you actually don't. And once you input it into an encryption protocol, again, no matter how good that encryption protocol is, garbage goes in, garbage comes out. So that's the benefit of our system. It's not the amount, it's more about the security and the assuredness that makes a difference.
Yeah, I was waiting for a question like that. You can't say something exciting like quantum and then not really go into the detail. But I mean, maybe we can tempt you. We've got pizza and drinks afterwards, so maybe we can really get into the weeds on that one. Any other questions from the audience? Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Ramy, you've talked a bit about one of the fundamental things about space infrastructure, which is that you can't service it once you've put it up there. And that obviously also means that nobody else has physical access to it. And I was wondering, from your perspective or anyone's, what are the cybersecurity implications of the fact that you obviously, it can't be physically attacked, that's not a vector that's available to someone trying to hack it, but also if someone does gain remote access, you can't go up there and hit a reset switch to put it back under your control.
Yeah, so that's actually a good point. So it is true that it's not like a bad agent is just going to send somebody out there to like open the box and see what's inside. But you don't necessarily have to do that to decrypt something. A lot of hacks don't happen by somebody physically having access to your cable. That's not to say that there are interesting hacks that happen exactly that way. But the way that we're protecting is that, say that somebody has access to the stream just because they could intercept that stream. And when I say intercept, just means that they could like get the same band, like come on the same frequency, if we want to use radio signals. If you have a bad key, if you're using a bad encryption key, that stream becomes very easy to guess what is encrypting it. So let's say that you're using something that only has 1 bit of randomness. That means I only actually need 2 guesses to exactly decrypt everything that you're putting there. So the quality of your encryption is going to impact the security of your transmission, no matter if somebody has actual physical access to it. And the other way around, if something does happen wrong and your keys are only being produced with very little randomness, you're right, there's nothing you could do about it. You have to stop using that system. And the problem isn't when you know, because when you know, the only thing you lose is, oh, I lost a couple of million sending this satellite up. But the problem is when you don't know. When you don't know that this is happening, and now you're losing much more than just 1 satellite. You're using the security of all of your data that's going through that satellite.
No, exactly. I'm just checking for time. I think we're coming up to time. So Ramy, I just wanted to say thank you for joining us today. So for any of you who don't know, CyberLates is a quarterly event. So if you'd like to join us at the next one, make sure you're signed up for the newsletter. I've already said the hashtag. I'm looking at our comms team just to make sure I'm on track. But yeah, thank you very much for joining us. If you'd like to know more about Plexal, some of the programs we've got running at the moment to support cyber startups, we've got Cyber Runway with applications coming up. We've got NCSC for startups as well. So make sure you check those out. Plexal team in the room, do you want to just do a quick show of hands? There we go. So yeah, we're here at Drinks if you want to have a chat. But for now, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.